This is the iconic Bf-109. It was the workhorse of the German Luftwaffe during World War II and the deadliest fighter in history. In this video, we'll focus on the most produced G or Gustav variant. In particular, we'll look at the G6, of which more than 12,000 examples were produced. When the G6 model became operational in the first months of 1943, it wasn't a super fighter when compared with its adversaries, but it was a solid design that could fill many different roles, and the G6 model saw combat in every theatre of German operations. My name is David Webb, and this is Blue Paw Print. The G6 had a typical all-metal construction, with a single spar wing and fabric-covered control surfaces. During the design, much emphasis was put on lightness and ease of maintenance in operational conditions. The structure was mainly riveted with flush countersunk rivets used on external surfaces to reduce drag. The plane measured 29 feet 4 inches in length and stood 8 feet 6 inches tall on its wheels, and the wingspan was 32 feet 7 inches. The plane had an empty weight of just over 6,000 pounds. And when fully loaded, it weighed 7,716 pounds. The fuselage consisted of 10 sections. The front section included the engine and machine guns. The second section included the cockpit, and under the cockpit floor was a fuselage middle beam upon which the wing spars were attached. The third section incorporated an L-shaped fuel tank. The most important parts positioned in the sections behind was the radio equipment and tailwheel shock strut at the rear. The construction technique of the rear fuselage behind the cockpit was a peculiar feature of the Bf-109. Each section in the fuselage was made from two halves. These two halves were put together with horizontal rows of rivets on top and bottom of the sections. To put the fuselage sections together, each half section was bent inwards. This way, they were connected through flanges. The two sections were then put together with a single line of vertical rivets. The longitudinal stringers were pushed through the holes in the frame. This made for a strong and lightweight fuselage. The Bf-109 was comparatively well armoured. The windshield and the rear section of the opening canopy were reinforced with 2.36 inches of laminated armoured glass. Behind the pilot's seat, there was 0.43 inches thick armour, and a 0.86 inches layered duralumin armour behind the fuel tank. The first units of the G6 had steel armour behind the pilot's head that were 0.43 inches thick, although in later models, the Galland armour was introduced, and it consisted of an armoured glass panel behind the pilot to improve visibility. The tail section was a separate module and was attached with bolts to the fuselage frame. Most G6 models had a typical all-metal tail with fabric-covered control surfaces. On most 109s, there were no other trim controls for the pilot except the elevator trim. A trim wheel was on the left-hand side of the cockpit, and it changed the angle of the horizontal stabilizer. Besides using the trim on normal flight conditions, it was also important to maintain control in high-speed dives. The wings of the 109 had a single spar. Both wings were attached to the fuselage with bolts. The installation and removal of the wings was relatively simple, and after removing the wings, the fuselage still sat upon its undercarriage. Coolant radiators were installed just below both wings, near the wing root. Coolers had hydraulically operated adjustable metal flaps in the front and rear. During the flight, these flaps were automatically controlled and adjusted with the help of the thermostat. Only during the landing, the radiator flap control was changed to manual, and the coolant flaps were fully open to increase the drag and improve the effect of the landing flaps. The coolant system, however, was a notorious weak spot of the Bf-109. as only minor damage could disable the system and thereby cause the engine to seize. Although the pilot could shut the damaged radiator from the coolant circuit if the problem was noticed in time. Ailerons were duralumin covered with linen fabric. All metal landing flaps were located between the radiator flaps and the ailerons. A peculiar feature of the 109's wings was the leading edge slats. At certain angles of attack, the negative air pressure on the surface of the wing pulled out the slats. They opened automatically as the speed decreased below 124 miles an hour on level flight and at higher speeds under G-load on tighter turns. These slats improved the plane's low speed and stalling characteristics, but the slats were not synchronized and they could open asymmetrically on turns, which in turn could disturb the pilot's aim during a dogfight. In a typical combat engagement against bombers, the pilot would climb to 26,000 feet. The Bf-109 climbed well, and the time to altitude was about 10 minutes. While climbing, the pilot would turn on the oxygen system. The 109 would rarely fight alone, and as the pilots approached the combat area, weapons would be switched on. The standard armament consisted of one 20mm MXY-7 cannon, installed between the cylinder blocks and firing through the hollow propeller axle. In addition, there were two 13mm MG-131 machine guns installed over the engine right in front of the cockpit. The machine guns created noticeable bumps on the cowling that are a feature of the model. Each 13mm machine gun held 300 rounds of ammunition, and the cannon magazine contained 200 rounds. The muzzle velocity of the 13mm machine guns was around 700 to 750 meters per second, and the rate of fire was around 900 rounds per minute, or 20 seconds of continuous fire. For the 20mm cannon, the muzzle velocity was 700 meters per second, and the rate of fire around 700 rounds per minute, or about 17 seconds if the pilot continuously fired. The pilot would generally engage enemies at a maximum distance of 760 yards. But the ground crew could adjust the guns to converge at different distances, depending upon the pilot's preference. The guns were able to be effective at longer ranges. In tests, the MG-131 was found to be able to hit on target over 1 mile away. The weapons were charged electrically, and white markers would appear above the ammunition counters to show that the weapons were ready. It was also possible to carry either a bomb or a drop tank under the fuselage. This could be a 79-gallon drop tank, a 551-pound bomb, or a 551-pound cluster bomb, or even a 1,100-pound bomb. But if carrying that large a bomb, the plane's performance suffered greatly. Bf-109s attacked in smaller flights, such as pairs or groups of 4 fighters. The leader of the group would maneuver to a favorable position and then start to engage. The Bf-109 G6 used a KG-13A stick. Before firing, the pilot first pulled the security switch forward, revealing a cannon button in the center. The cannon could be fired with a thumb, and machine guns could be fired with an index finger. If the enemy had escorting fighters, the Bf-109s would frequently have time for one pass before the escort fighters could be on their tails. In a tight formation, they would charge against the bomber formations and choose their targets and fire. After the attack, the German formation would scatter to individual planes and pairs. They would then need to switch their attention to the large numbers of escorting fighters before they could regroup or make a new pass against the bombers. When low on fuel and ammo, and if damaged or in an unfavorable position, the pilots could attempt to disengage and return to their airfields. The DB605A1 engine was a 12-cylinder inverted V engine with a maximum power output of 1,475 horsepower at sea level on emergency power. This engine could propel the Bf-109 to a maximum straight level speed of 400 miles an hour and could reach a maximum speed of 466 miles an hour in a dive. Beyond this speed, the airframe could become unstable. The plane had a very fast climb rate of 3,543 feet per minute and a maximum altitude of 39,000 feet. Such a powerful engine required active cooling to avoid overheating. Therefore, the DB605 engine was equipped with a cooling system featuring 2 radiators positioned below the wings near the wing roots. The radiators were connected to 2 metal header tanks on either side of the engine that cooled the engine with a mixture of water and glycol. The hot coolant was chilled by the oncoming airflow before returning back to the engine. The DB605A engine could operate at a maximum of 2,800 RPM for short periods. However, it was more usual to operate at 2,300 RPM, at which it would produce a continuous power output of 1,080 horsepower. There was an automatic supercharger that was crucial for maintaining consistent power, especially at high altitudes. The supercharger received air from an intake on the side of the fuselage. The air traveled through a pipe to a 16-blade centrifugal impeller, which compressed the air before feeding it into the cylinders. During climbs and intense maneuvers such as dogfights, the supercharger boosted the intake pressure, providing a power boost, but the supercharger could overpressure the engine if the pilots were not careful. The propeller was metal-bladed and it had a diameter of 9.8 feet. It was fitted with an automatic propeller pitch adjusting mechanism that greatly lessened the pilot's workload in combat situations. A horseshoe-shaped oil tank with a volume of 9.51 gallons was installed in the front part of the engine. The oil cooling system was installed below the engine. The engine had 2 major overhaul periods, and each overhaul was conducted after 100 hours of flying. Throughout its operational history, one of the most serious drawbacks of the 109 was its limited range. The main fuel tank was an L-shaped self-sealing rubber tank with a capacity of just over 105 gallons. Internal fuel provided only about 1.5 hours of flying time on combat missions, or around 161 miles of combat range. The fuel was fed into the cylinders by an injection system and 2 high-pressure pumps that sucked fuel from the tank. Standard G6 models used 87 octane fuel. That was a significant plus, as fuel with a higher octane rating was difficult to obtain in sufficient quantities. The 109's high-altitude performance was better than that of the FW-190, which was especially important in defense missions on the Western Front. Due to the plane's limited range with internal fuel, especially on the Western Front, the external fuel tank was almost a standard item on combat missions. On the Eastern Front, this lack of range was not so huge a problem, as most of the action happened around the front lines, and German airfields were usually located within a short distance from the front line. The external fuel tank had a capacity of just over 79 gallons. With an external fuel tank, the operational range was increased to 280 miles. Fuel flowed from the external fuel tank to the main tank with the use of pressurized air. The pilot could monitor the fuel flow through a transparent tube inside the cockpit, and when he saw air bubbles or dirty fuel, the pilot knew that the external tank was empty. The landing gear was hydraulically operated. The G6's tailwheel was non-retractable. There was no emergency mechanism for retracting the landing gear, but the pilot could lower the landing gear in the case of hydraulic failure. A T-shaped handle on the right side of the pilot released locking pins on the landing gear. The gear would then lower under its own weight. In order to fully extend the gear, however, the pilot was instructed to roll from side to side. The landing gear was the weak point of the airplane. It's estimated that around 10% of BF-109s were lost during takeoff and landings because of narrow landing gear. This caused problems for inexperienced pilots due to tip-overs. For field maintenance, it was possible to make large repairs and replace the wings while the plane was standing on the undercarriage. It was also possible to load the plane onto a train car or to attach the fuselage to a car so that the plane could be transported by road. This feature helped a lot in maintaining the planes in difficult field conditions and when recovering and transporting damaged planes to repair plants. A well-known feature of the BF-109 was its very tight and cramped cockpit. This was especially noticeable when the 109 was compared with American planes. This small cockpit had its benefits as the cockpit was well designed and all the switches were within easy reach. The windscreen was a bulky-looking item with heavily welded frames. On a standard version, the canopy consisted of 3 parts, with the middle section being movable. On the left-hand side of the cockpit, the most noticeable features were 2 large hand wheels to operate the flaps and the elevator trim. On the left side, the pilot had a primer pump, throttle lever. On the throttle lever, the pilot had a rocker switch for adjusting the prop pitch manually, fuel selector, tailwheel lock, and the canopy emergency release handle. On the right-hand side, the pilot had oxygen system controls, radio switches on the floor as 2 grey boxes, and radiator control switches, as well as the main circuit breaker panel. There was a large yellow tube fitted with a small transparent tube inside. Through this tube, fuel from the external tank was fed to the main tank, and from the transparent panel, the pilot could monitor to see that fuel was flowing correctly. The main instrument panel had basic but adequate instruments. On the bottom left corner was the landing gear indicator lamps and landing gear push rods. On the left-hand side and in the center of the panel was the navigation instrument panel with compass, speed indicator, altimeter, and a combined artificial horizon and turn bank indicator. On the right-hand side of the artificial horizon was the boost pressure gauge, and below it was the RPM gauge. Next to the RPM gauge was a propeller clock prop pitch indicator. On the right was the coolant temperature gauge, fuel gauge, and combined fuel oil pressure gauge. Next to the fuel gauge was the red low fuel warning light that was meant to turn on when there was fuel left for a maximum of 20 minutes of flight. The upper part of the instrument panel was dominated by the Revi 16B gun sight and its mount. In emergencies, the gun sight could be pushed forward and turned sideways, so the pilot's head would not hit the gun sight in a rough landing. It was also possible to rapidly remove the gun sight from its mount. On the left-hand side were the ammunition counters with vertical bars showing the machine gun ammunition and the middle bar showing the cannon ammunition. The clock was located on the upper right-hand side of the instrument panel below the gun sight. Before starting up, the canopy would be closed, so that the airflow could not break the canopy. The trim would be moved to the +1 position, and the battery switched on. The prop pitch controller would be switched on, and the propeller switched to manual. Then the propeller pitch indicator would show 12 o'clock. After that, the propeller was returned to automatic, and the propeller pitch indicator showed the 12:30 position. Fuel valves would be opened. Throttle would be opened a third. Coolant radiator set to manual and fully opened. And the pilot gave 4 to 6 pumps from the primer pump. Fuel lines were filled by activating the electric fuel pump. When the mechanic gave the sign, the magneto switch would be moved to position M1+2. The starting handle would be pulled powerfully with the left hand. The pilot would press the pump while the engine ignited. When the engine started, the throttle would be decreased slightly. After checking fuel pressure and the engine was running properly, the electric fuel pump would be switched off. To taxi, the pilot would release the brakes and the plane would start to move. While taxiing, the plane is only controlled by using the brakes. It was difficult to see in front of the 109 while taxiing, and so visibility was very poor. To counteract this, the pilot made S-turns while taxiing. Often there was also a mechanic sitting on the wing, giving directions. For takeoff, the pilot would ensure the canopy was closed, the tail wheel was locked, and the trim adjusted to +1. Flaps would be set to 20 degrees open and the propeller to automatic. The coolant radiator would be set to automatic and electric fuel pump switched on. The engine power would be steadily increased until the boost pressure reached 1.4 ATA. The 109 was known to swing right and left on takeoff, and the movement had to be countered by appropriate use of rudder, which could cash out inexperienced pilots. At 62 miles an hour, the tail would lift, and at that point, the rudder became much more effective. When the speed reached just over 105 miles an hour, the plane would lift. Just after liftoff, the pilot would brake the wheels to stop them from spinning and retract the landing gear. The Bf-109 is the most produced single-seat fighter aircraft in history, with a staggering number of 34,000 units built. It saw combat in a wide variety of environments, from the freezing cold of the Arctic theatre to the heat and sand of the Mediterranean, and from treetop heights on the Eastern Front to the edge of the stratosphere in the defense of the Reich missions. Around 30,000 enemy aircraft were destroyed by the Bf-109 during its service, making it the deadliest fighter in history in terms of aerial kills. By the time the Bf-109 G6 was introduced in February 1943, Germany had already started losing the initiative on the front lines. The Gustav carried many of the most successful and well-known fighter aces in history. It was also a plane in which some of the most famous aces perished as the tide of the war gradually turned against Germany and the Luftwaffe. Thanks to Harry Huapainen for help with this script, and to the Finnish Military Aviation Museum for their generous help in providing the research materials. Any errors are entirely our own. This is the B-17F Flying Fortress. The B-17 was the backbone of the Allied bombing campaigns over Europe during World War II. It was renowned for its daring daylight missions. The crews endured severe losses while spearheading the tactics that helped lead to the Axis defeat. My name is David Webb, and this is Blue Paw Print. The aircraft was 74 feet 9 inches long, and on the ground it was 19 feet 1 inches tall. The wingspan of 103 feet 9 inches is around 3 feet shorter than a modern Boeing 737. The skin of the plane was stressed duralumin. This stressed skin was notably thin, with a thickness of somewhere around 1/50th of an inch, which is about 3 to 4 times thicker than standard household foil. Beneath its slender exterior lay a robust airframe. The fuselage was reinforced with formers and longerons. The wings featured a more intricate design with a twin longeron structure supported by multiple trusses. On top of this was corrugated aluminum sheeting, and then an outer skin of thin duralumin. The control surfaces were covered with doped fabric. The B-17F was no lightweight, and empty, the aircraft weighed around 34,000 pounds. It was designed for a maximum takeoff weight of 65,000 pounds. However, if the aircraft was pushed to its absolute limit, it could take off with a weight of up to 72,000 pounds. When built, the fuselage was made up of several sections. Each section was given a number. At the front was section 41, which housed the plexiglass nose and the bombardier's and navigator stations. It could be equipped with up to 4 machine guns. Next was section 42, which encompassed the flight deck and forward entrance hatch, containing the pilot's and co-pilot stations, alongside all flight controls and instruments. On the top of this section sat a dorsal turret, which could be manned by the engineer. It was armed with twin 50 caliber machine guns. Next was section 43, a space dedicated to the bomb bay. Section 44 housed the radio and ball turret compartment. The radio compartment housed a .50 Browning machine gun, and it provided additional defense against the foes attacking from above. There was a ball turret armed with 2 .50 Brownings cramped inside the ball alongside the ammo and the gunner. We'll talk more about the ball turret in a dedicated video. Section 46 was the waist section, offering positions for 2 waist gunners. Each of them manned with one 50 cal that was firing through the waist window. On our model of B-17, these windows were set one across another. So in this tight space, gunners sometimes got in the way of each other during the fight. This problem was solved only on the next model of B-17. Section 47 and 49 were known as the Stinger and encompassed the tail wheel assembly and primary components of the rudder and elevators, as well as a tail gun enclosure. Here, the tail gunner handled a twin .50 Browning machine gun. Then, Section 48 completed the tail assembly and included the large vertical stabilizer and rudder. The aircraft was manned by a crew of 10, and the most important position was the commander.
Power reduction.
The co-pilot served as the executive officer and was the commander's extension, ready to assume control and responsibilities whenever necessary. There was an engineer, and he was tasked with a variety of roles, from monitoring engine operation and fuel consumption with the co-pilot to ensuring the armament's readiness. The engineer also worked closely with both the co-pilot and bombardier, managing bomb racks and maintaining the aircraft's arsenal.
All good, Taylor. Time to man that gun.
To repel the attacks of enemy fighters, he had at his disposal a dorsal turret armed with 2 .50 caliber Brownings.
Navigator to pilot, 20 minutes to the target.
There was a navigator, and he was tasked with charting the route using dead reckoning, radio, and celestial navigation, as well as continuously calculating and guiding the bomber's position from departure to destination and back. He could also man a .50 caliber gun in one of the windows in the left or right side of the nose when necessary. The bombardier's task was singular, yet far from simple: the delivery of ordnance on target. Every other function of the aircraft and crew served this ultimate goal. He could also man the guns installed in the plexiglass nose. A radio operator who could also man a .50 caliber gun stowed under the roof of his compartment. The gun would need to be pointed out of the roof window in the event of a fight. There were also several dedicated gunners that we'll go through later in the film, tasked with defending the flying fortress against the enemy fighter attack.
Ball turret to pilot. Flak dead ahead. Hold on, men.
The aircraft was fortified with armor plates, strategically placed all across the plane and mounted on rubber padding. These plates, made of thin manganese steel, were primarily designed to shield the crew and critical equipment from shrapnel. They also offered some protection against 30 caliber bullets, but their capability to withstand direct hits from large caliber projectiles was limited. Given the light armor and thin skin of the B-17, pilots were recommended to change course for at least 30 degrees for 10 seconds every 40 seconds when flying through flak. Anti-air crews on the ground would try and estimate the position of the plane for when the flak reached the correct altitude. With the planes moving in a somewhat random manner, the B-17 crews could reduce the number of on-target hits. But when flying in formation, things could easily get out of hand. Such movements done without synchronization between the planes would lead to collisions.
There's a fort on top of us! Damn it, Taylor, where are you?
So course and elevation changes were done by following the maneuvers of the lead plane in the formation.
That was close.
The B-17F's primary offensive capability was delivered through its bomb load, capable of carrying up to 8 1,000-pound bombs internally, with additional capacity for 2 rarely used external underwing pylons. The maximum bomb load of 9,600 pounds significantly limited the B-17F's combat range. At full bomb load, the aircraft's combat range was so reduced that it could not reliably reach strategic targets in either the European or Pacific theatres. Optimal load calculations were therefore a critical part of mission planning. Typically, a bomb load ranging from 4,000 to 6,000 pounds allowed for a combat range of 1,300 to 1,400 miles. As the aircraft approached the target zone, the pilot would engage the autopilot,
Autopilot on. Bombardier, it's your fort.
passing control of the aircraft to the bombardier.
Bombay doors open.
This was a very dangerous time for the crew, as it gave the flak batteries on the ground ample time to target the B-17s as they flew straight and level. The bombardier would use his Norden bomb sight, which incorporated gyroscopes and a mechanical computer, which calculated adjustments for height, speed, wind speed, and bearing. When the bombardier saw the crosshairs over the target, he would drop the bombs and report bombs away.
Bombs out. Pilot, it's your plane.
The pilot would then regain control and head for home.
Let's get out of here.
The B-17F was bristling with defensive firepower, utilizing 50 caliber M2 Browning air-cooled machine guns. The ventral and ball turrets each had 2 50 caliber guns, complemented by dual 50 caliber machine guns at the rear, and single 50 caliber machine guns at each waist. The nose sections of armament varied, ranging from a single 30 caliber machine gun from the bombardier and a 50 caliber machine gun for the navigator, to as many as 4 50 caliber machine guns in upgraded configurations. Additionally, a 50 caliber machine gun was placed for the radio operator's use. Formations were essential in safe passage. A formation multiplies the number of guns that can shoot at the enemy fighters. B-17s, being large 4-engine bombers, could survive a lot of punishment, whereas smaller fighter planes could be taken out by just several hits. With a formation, the sheer number of tracers going in the enemy pilot's direction exerted massive psychological pressure on the fighter pilots. The Germans figured out that attacking from the nose in level flight was less dangerous, due to the fast closing speed and fewer B-17 guns pointing at them. When a gunner spotted enemy planes, even from far away, he would immediately warn the crew via the intercom using the clock system, where all the directions were designated as numbers on the clock, starting from 12, meaning directly in front of the B-17, with 6 meaning directly behind the bomber. So when the crew heard "Bandits, 6 o'clock high," they knew that enemy fighters would attack from behind and above the B-17, and they could expect the enemy planes to show themselves in their own areas of fire from the specified direction. If a Bf-109 attacked from behind, the tail gunner would be the first to spot and warn the others.
Bandit, 6 o'clock, low!
The upper turret or ball turret would then swing to the rear and be ready to deliver ordnance into the approaching enemy.
4 of them, 3 o'clock, low!
If 3 o'clock low came over the intercom, the ball turret and right waist gunner would open fire, and the left waist gunner and dorsal turret gunner would be ready to shoot at the enemy fighter as it flew past. Only dorsal and ball turrets had reflector sights. Other gunners used open sights. Even the tail gunner had only a short stick with a ring and an iron open sight that was aimed parallel to his guns. Add to this, in a tight box formation, the heat of battle and growing war weariness, friendly fire was inevitable. While friendly fire between the B-17s in the same box was not uncommon, there are no actual statistics that we could find for the number of incidents. The bomber was powered by 4 Wright Cyclone R1820-97 radial 9-cylinder air-cooled engines. Each engine was equipped with a turbo supercharger and a 3-bladed propeller featuring controllable blade pitch. If the engine had a fire, malfunctioned, or was damaged enough to stop working, the pilot could turn the engine off completely and feather the propeller to minimize drag. The engines numbered 1 to 4 from left to right from the pilot's perspective, and they were capable of a nominal maximum power of 1,200 horsepower each. However, in wartime emergency power, they could briefly achieve up to 1,380 horsepower.
Let's speed up and get to the bigger formation.
The aircraft was capable of cruising speeds of up to 200 miles an hour, with a maximum speed of 299 miles per hour at an altitude of 25,000 feet. Remarkably, under WEP, the B-17F could reach speeds of 325 miles an hour at this altitude, but only for a few minutes. The service ceiling reached an impressive 37,500 feet. According to the regulations, a B-17 should be able to fly on just 2 engines. Although sometimes, battle damage to the wings and the fuselage forced the crew to bail out when even only 1 engine was damaged. But there were a few times when planes could limp back, constantly losing altitude, and coming in on a wing and a prayer still do a successful emergency landing with just 1 engine running. The B-17's main fuel supply came from 6 tanks distributed across both wings, 3 per wing, with engines 1 and 4 each being served by 1 tank, and engines 2 and 3 receiving fuel from 2 tanks each. To ensure optimal performance and fuel efficiency, an electric pump could pump fuel from one wing to another. In addition, the B-17F was equipped with Tokyo tanks. This was a system comprising of 18 self-collapsible additional tanks, 9 in each wing. These tanks had no dedicated pumps, but instead relied on gravity to transfer fuel to the main tanks. They were placed to balance weight and maintain aircraft stability. When the plane was taking off under maximum weight, all fuel tanks, including the Tokyo tanks, had to be full. This was so the wings were robust enough to deal with the extreme forces of the takeoff. The Tokyo tanks added about 1,080 US gallons to the existing 1,700 US gallons carried in the 6 regular wing tanks. For missions prioritizing range over bomb load, an auxiliary tank capable of holding 820 US gallons could be mounted in the bomb bay, pushing the total fuel capacity to an impressive 3,600 US gallons. Despite their advantages, the Tokyo tanks had a risk of vapor buildup, which could transform them into explosive hazards under combat conditions. The main tanks had a self-sealing design. This design was a 2-layer system of rubber compounds encased in a metal outer shell. The outer shell was made of soft aluminum alloy, inside of which was a container made out of several layers of gasoline-soluble rubber. When the tank was intact, the gasoline-reactive rubber was isolated from the gasoline. If the tank was punctured by a bullet or a shell fragment, the inner sac would bulge under the force of the hit. The rubber around the newly created hole would then expand and close the leak, effectively self-sealing the tank. Due to the thick walls, these tanks had a lower capacity than the unprotected ones, but were significantly safer. The Tokyo tanks lacked an outer metal skin. They were just thick-skinned, self-sealing rubber bags put inside the empty spaces in the wings, from which fuel flowed to the main tanks.
How are we looking? Hydraulics are down.
The aircraft's hydraulic system was deliberately designed to be as minimalistic as possible, operating solely the cowl flaps and the wheel brakes. In contrast, the B-17F leveraged an extensive electrical system, powering the turrets, landing gear, wing flaps, bomb bay doors, and the majority of onboard instruments, ensuring ample power generation during the mission, as long as even one of the engines was running. An auxiliary gasoline-powered generator unit placed in the tail section provided an emergency power source for battery recharging and essential radio operations.
Pilot to navigator, how far is the emergency airfield?
Navigation was a hugely difficult and complicated task. Usually there were only 3 officers on the plane: the pilot, the co-pilot, and the navigator, highlighting the importance of the role.
Roger, navigator. I have visuals. Good job, Crosby.
The navigator utilized a combination of airspeed, bearing, altitude, relative airspeed, radio bearings, celestial observations, and landmark recognition to ascertain the aircraft's position. By integrating these different techniques, the navigator was able to chart the course on his map. The skill of the navigator was an essential part of the mission's success. The startup procedure for the B-17F Flying Fortress was conducted with the help of a checklist. The pilot would activate the master switch, powering the aircraft's primary electrical systems. The co-pilot would engage the battery switches and inverters, confirming their operational status. With the electrical system on, attention would shift to the aircraft's hydraulic system, specifically the parking brakes. A hydraulic check would be conducted to ensure that the aircraft was stationary during the engine startup, with the pilot verifying the activation and integrity of the booster pumps. The carburetor filters would then be opened, facilitating optimal air intake for engine combustion. The fuel quantity across all tanks was checked. The engines would be started sequentially from number 1 to number 4, with a careful approach to synchronize their operations post-ignition. Following the engine startup, flight indicators and vacuum pressures would be checked for accuracy. Simultaneously, the radio would be activated and the radio operator would confirm that the radio equipment was operational and ready to use. Instrument checks would be performed to ensure that all systems were within operational parameters, followed by a crew report to confirm readiness. The engine run-up phase included locking the brakes, setting the trim tabs, and exercising turbos and props to assess their responsiveness. Generators were then checked and turned off, followed by a thorough run-up of the engines to confirm their performance under increased power. Before takeoff, the tail wheel would be locked to ensure directional stability. The gyro would be set for navigation accuracy, and the generators reactivated, fully powering the aircraft's electrical system. The B-17 was designed with some older concepts in mind, dating back to the late 1920s. The plane could have been made lighter and faster, or with better bomb capacity at the expense of its great resilience to damage. The structure was difficult to completely break, and with redundant systems, the B-17 was a hard plane to kill. The Germans calculated in 1943 that to bring down one B-17, they needed to hit the aircraft with about 20 20mm shells from behind, or with 4 specially designed 30mm shells. Considering ammo usage and expected misses, 2 average German pilots flying Bf-109s would have to pour all of their ammo at a single B-17 to achieve success. In early 1944, Allied fighters started to escort bombers almost to the target, and German fighter losses started to mount. In the last months of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a pale shadow of its former deadly force that American bombers met in 1943. The hopes of the US AAF generals that flying fortresses could successfully defend themselves without fighter escorts were shattered, sadly, with the huge loss of life in 1942 to 1943. On October the 14th, 1943, also known as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers, but in return claimed 288 fighters shot down, though that number is thought to be exaggerated, and in fact, only 40 enemy airplanes were lost. Between 1935 and May 1945, 12,731 B-17s were produced. Of these aircraft, 4,735 were lost during combat missions. As of today, only 3 B-17Fs remain in existence. Only one of them saw use in combat, and it flew a full 25 combat mission tour over Europe, the Memphis Belle. The F4U Corsair was revered as one of the most formidable fighter planes of World War II and beyond. It was a marvel of aeronautical engineering. With its distinctive wing design and powerful engine, it achieved a top speed of over 440 miles per hour. Pilots love its robust construction and survivability, which combined with its performance, contributed to its legendary status in military and aviation history. That said, its incredible engine made the Corsair as feared as it was respected. We'll take you through the process the pilot had to go through to get a successful takeoff later in this film. My name's David Webb, and this is Blue Paw Print. The Corsair's fuselage was constructed of aluminum formers intricately shaped for aerodynamic efficiency and connected by longerons, which made for a lightweight and sturdy construction. Aluminum sheets up to 1/10 of an inch or 2.5 millimeters thick covered the frame, except for the control surfaces, which were covered in fabric. This made the Corsair strong and lightweight. The shape of the fuselage frame varied along its length. Forward of the cockpit, the frame was roughly oval, transitioning to a tear-shaped cross-section and then to a conical form towards the rear. The frame was divided into 4 main sections: engine, forward, middle, and rear, with a total length of 33 feet 8 inches or 10.26 meters. A fireproof bulkhead was installed between the engine and the forward section. To maximize the efficiency of its powerful engine, the Corsair was equipped with a large propeller, which needed substantial clearance for takeoff and landing. Extra-long wheel struts were considered as a solution. However, the Corsair's design got around this issue through its recognizable wing structure. The solution for the Corsair was adopting an inverted gull-wing W-shaped design. The wing at the roots was angled downwards at -23 degrees, and then the outer folding wing sections were angled upwards at +8.5 degrees. This innovative wing design allowed for shorter landing gear, which also reduced drag at the junction of the wings and the airframe. But it was at the expense of added complexity in construction and increased weight. Despite these challenges, the overall design was remarkably sturdy and capable of withstanding maneuvers up to 11 G. Folding wings were essential for conserving space on an aircraft's carrier deck. The wing roots housed large intakes for the oil coolers and the engine supercharger, necessary for the efficient operation of the aircraft's powerful air-cooled engine at high speed and at high altitude. While functional for engine performance, these intakes produced a distinctive whistling sound at certain speeds, especially during dives, leading some Japanese ground troops to famously nickname the Corsair the Whistling Death. The center wing also contained landing gear wells and 2 hardpoints capable of carrying bombs up to 1,000 pounds or 454 kilograms each, or drop tanks. The folding sections of the wings had a metal skin on the forward part, extending from the leading edge to the main spar, while the area to the rear of the main spar was covered in fabric. 3.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns were mounted near the root of each folding console. Under the wings, racks were installed for HVAR 5-inch unguided rockets, accommodating 4 rockets per side. An essential aerodynamic feature was installing a 6-inch stall strip on the leading edge of the outer right wing, just outboard of the gun ports. This small addition corrected an early design flaw where the Corsair's wings had different stall speeds, causing the aircraft to tilt or even crash during landing. For instrumentation, a pitot tube was installed near the tip of the left wing, and a gun camera was mounted in the right wing near the guns. The Corsair's control surfaces were intricately designed to enhance its maneuverability and performance, so the aircraft featured 3 section flaps, 2 parts on the center wing and the third on the folding section. These flaps could have a downward deflection of up to 50 degrees for landing, which allowed for slower airspeeds without stalling. Additionally, the flaps could be deployed to 20 degrees for tighter maneuvers at slow speeds. Despite the many advancements of the F4U 4 model compared to its predecessors, the Corsair still had some handling issues. The powerful engine and large propeller generated considerable torque, which could cause the aircraft to tilt to one side if the throttle was suddenly increased. This was a significant concern during aborted landings, or if there were engine problems during takeoff. Pilots were advised to be cautious with throttle changes in such situations. If not carefully managed, an excessive increase of power could lead to wing clipping or even a complete rollover. In earlier models, this torque effect contributed to the Corsair being nicknamed the Ensign Eliminator, as it was particularly dangerous for inexperienced pilots who could overreact to the aircraft's behavior. The Corsair was powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 18W Double Wasp, an air-cooled radial engine renowned for its robust performance. This engine featured 2 circles of 9 specially arranged cylinders stacked one after the other, giving 18 cylinders in total. The engine displacement was 46 litres. The W in the engine's name signifies the presence of a water methanol injection system. This system was capable of temporarily boosting the engine's performance at the expense of a significantly reduced lifespan of the engine. Under this boost, the engine could achieve a power output of 2,450 horsepower or 1,830 kilowatts. However, this mode of operation, known as Wartime Emergency Power, or WEP, was intended only for extreme circumstances. It could wear out the engine even when it was used for a very short period, drastically shortening the operational lifespan from hundreds of hours to a dozen minutes. During World War II, the average service life of a fighter engine was approximately 2 months of active duty, translating to around 50 hours of motor operation. The F4U was equipped with a 4-bladed Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller measuring 13 feet 2 inches in diameter, or a shade under 4 meters. This combination of the engine and propeller was integral to achieving the aircraft's maximum speed of 446 miles per hour, or 717 kilometers per hour, and a maximum climb rate of 4,360 feet per minute, or 22.1 meters per second. The Corsair's fuel system was designed with both capacity and versatility in mind, essential for its operational range in various mission scenarios. The main fuel tank was self-sealing, a critical feature for combat situations, and had a capacity of 233 US gallons, or 872 liters. This self-sealing design was a 2-layer system of rubber compounds encased in a metal outer shell. If the tank was punctured by a bullet, the inner sac would bulge under the force of the hit. The rubber around the newly created hole would then expand and close the leak, effectively self-sealing the tank. In addition to the main tank, the Corsair was equipped to carry additional drop tanks under the center wing pylons. Each drop tank had a capacity of 150 gallons, or 568 liters. The total volume of them both was even larger than the main tank. The fuel system was designed to supply the engine from any of the tanks, and notably, fuel from the drop tanks could be transferred into the main tank as needed. This flexibility in fuel management allowed for prolonged flight duration and operational adaptability. Without the drop tanks, the aircraft's maximum range was 1,156 miles, or 1,860 kilometers. With the drop tanks, the maximum range was considerably extended to 1,800 miles, or 2,890 kilometers. The Corsair's built-in armament consisted of 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns. Underneath its wings was the option for 8 5-inch HVAR rockets in launch racks, and a combination of bombs, rockets, or drop tanks on the 2 underwing pylons. This flexibility meant that it could be equipped as a close support fighter bomber or a long-range fighter as needed. The maximum external load the aircraft could carry was 4,000 pounds, or 1,816 kilograms. The standard armament Browning M2 air-cooled belt-fed machine guns with 3 in each wing was typical for American fighters of the era. These were effective against light enemy fighters. The 2 outermost machine guns on the Corsair held 375 rounds per barrel, while the remaining 4 had 400 rounds each. Gun convergence was usually set between 300 and 500 yards, depending upon the pilot's preference, enhancing accuracy in aerial engagements. They could fire between 750 to 850 rounds per minute at a muzzle velocity of up to 2,900 feet per second, or 890 meters per second. The 650 grain, or 42 gram bullets were effective in aerial combat up to 900 yards, or 800 meters, and could harm ground forces from an even greater distance. Each 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, or HVAR, weighed around 134 pounds, or 61 kilos, and had a 7.5 pound, or 3.4 kilogram warhead. These were used against relatively light ground targets. For heavily fortified targets, the Corsair could employ bombs of up to 1,000 pounds or 454 kilograms. Alternatively, it could be equipped with two 11.75-inch or 298mm Tiny Tim rockets. Each one weighed 1,255 pounds or 569 kilograms and carried a 148.5-pound or 67.4 kilogram warhead. These air-to-ground rockets were carried on the underwing pylons in place of bombs and were effective up to 1,600 yards or 1,460 meters. The cockpit of the Corsair featured a distinctively designed canopy with a slightly bulging midsection and a forward panel made of 1.5-inch or 38mm bulletproof glass, offering crucial protection while maintaining visibility. The pilot's seat was designed with safety in mind, featuring an armoured backplate up to 0.5 inches or 12.7mm thick. Inside the cabin, the left side console housed the oxygen controls, wing folding controls, the engine control unit, which combined the throttle and related controls. Further down was the hand pump lever for the hydraulic system. Also, on the left console was a sloped panel where the pilot could access the fuel, flaps, and landing gear controls. In front of the pilot were two armament switch boxes from which the array of weapons could be selected. On the main panel, there was navigational instruments, engine indicators, and fuel indicators. Below this panel was the central console. This included gun charge controls, oil cooling system controls and indicators, emergency landing gear release, hydraulic pressure gauge, and fresh air control. On the right side console were controls for the electrical system and radio equipment. The rudder pedals, equipped with main wheel brakes, were positioned below the main panel and on either side of the central console. Directly in front of the pilot's seat was the control stick, which included a gun trigger switch, a bomb or drop tank release button, and a rocket launch thumb button. In front of the pilot was a simple Mark 8 reflector gun sight. Before starting the engine, the battery switch was turned on by the pilot. The fuel tank selector was set to on, and warning light bulbs were tested for functionality. The booster pump fuel switch was set to boost by the pilot. The ignition was turned to both, and the engine started. The mixture control was moved from idle cutoff to rich, and the engine idled at 600 to 800 RPM until oil pressure normalized. The pilot would then very gently ease the throttle until the engine reached 1000 RPM and the oil temperature reached 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. During taxiing, the pilot used S-shaped plane movement as there was no visibility past the massive engine. The canopy was open and manually locked for takeoff. The tail wheel was locked and the rudder, elevator, and aileron tab controls were set to counteract the engine's significant torque. To prepare for takeoff, the pilot would hold the brakes, gradually increasing the throttle until the tail started to rise under the air draft from the propeller. As the plane accelerated, the pilot carefully monitored the airspeed, waiting for the indicator to reach over 81 miles per hour or 130 kilometers per hour, at which point it was time to gently pull the stick, guiding the aircraft into the air. After takeoff, manifold pressure was reduced, engine power was decreased, and the landing gear was retracted using the hydraulic system, incorporating the Corsair's unique gear design. The main wheel struts were designed to retract backwards, rotating 90 degrees during retraction. Before engaging in combat, the pilot turned the gun sight switch on, moved the gun charging handles from safe to the charge position, and pushed them once. Each handle charged all 3 machine guns on one wing. The master armament switch and each gun switch were turned on. If the pilot intended to use rockets or drop bombs, the relevant switches were turned on to arm the bombs or ready the rocket launch circuits. The Mark 8 reflector gun sight was used for both ground attacks and aerial combat, and often projected the target reticle directly onto the bulletproof frontal glass panel in the F4U4. To fire the guns, the pilot pressed the trigger on the control stick, or pressed buttons on the same stick to launch rockets or drop bombs. More than 12,500 Corsairs of all modifications were produced, of which more than 2,300 were different variants of the F4U4. During World War II, Corsairs had a win-loss ratio with the enemy planes of 11.3 to 1. In the Korean War, Corsairs mostly served in a ground support role, but still scored many victories. The Corsair remained in production for over a decade, from 1942 to 1953, well into the jet age. It was a mainstay in the United States Air Force and then several other countries for over 30 years, showcasing its enduring utility and effectiveness as a military aircraft. The Messerschmitt, or Me-262, was an iconic jet fighter from World War II. Designed by the Germans, it was the first mass-produced and deployed jet fighter. In this video, we'll talk about the Me-262A1A Schwalbe variant. Translated into English, Schwalbe means swallow. As production of the Me-262 was largely decentralized to avoid Allied bombs, small details or even instrument panel layouts can differ from plane to plane. That said, we've picked the details that we think are most representative of the aircraft. I'm David Webb, and this is Blue Paw Print. The Me-262 was a low-wing, twin-engined monoplane. The length was 34 feet 9 inches, or 10.6 meters. In cross-section, the main part of the Me-262's fuselage looks like a slightly inflated triangle with rounded corners. This shape was deemed to be the optimal for low cost, ease of assembly, maintenance, as well as having low drag. The fuselage was built out of both steel and aluminum alloys. Some lighter alloys were harder to source during the war, and so steel was often used for availability and cost reasons. This would come at the price of extra weight. Some non-stressed elements of the plane, such as the fuel tank cover and the control panel, were even built from plywood. The airframe consisted of longerons and stringers, connected by formers. The formers were made of U-shaped and J-shaped sheets of metal and were held in place by the longerons. Such a design could be made with the use of an unskilled and often unwilling labor force. The nose resembled that of piston-engine aircraft of the era. It had a small window at the tip for a camera lens, which we'll talk about later. There were main bulkheads between the ammunition storage and forward fuel tank. Another bulkhead sat between the forward fuel tank and the cockpit. One sat behind the cockpit and the rear fuel tank, and another was behind the rear fuel tank. There was an additional smaller bulkhead to separate the gun camera compartment. The bulkhead between the gun's ammunition and the forward fuel tank was understandably reinforced and fireproof. The rest of the bulkheads were aluminum, with stiffeners and open holes for cables, tubes, and linkages. The skin of the aircraft was 2 mm or 1/16 of an inch thick sheets of duralumin plating. These were overlaid and riveted to the frame. Only the section housing the gun barrels had steel sheets to withstand the gun blasts. After assembly, the fuselage surface was polished and painted. Any holes or slits were covered with filler or doped fabric and then painted, reducing the drag of the plane. The wings were of a double spar design and were made entirely of metal. The main spar was made of steel, with an auxiliary spar made out of duralumin. Spars were connected by main ribs and auxiliary ribs. The skin consisted of 2 to 2.1 mm or 2/25 of an inch thick duralumin sheets. Only on the lower part of the wings there were segments of 0.25 mm or 1/10 of an inch thick steel sheet. The wingspan was 41 feet 4 inches or 12.6 meters. The wings had an angle of sweep on the leading edge of -17 degrees. The transverse angle of a wing on a plane is the angle at which the wings are positioned relative to the horizontal axis of the aircraft. On the ME-262, this was -5 degrees, which meant the wings were slightly pointed up. Along the entire leading edge of the wing, except for the areas occupied by the engine nacelles, were located retractable, automatic, 3-section slotted wing slats. These slats were designed to improve the wing's performance at high angles of attack, such as during slow-speed flight or when maneuvering. On the trailing edge of the wing were flaps. When extended, the flaps increased the wing's surface area, generating more lift at lower speeds, thereby allowing the aircraft to take off and land at those lower airspeeds. To avoid pilot error, on the ME-262, the flaps could only be deployed when the undercarriage was lowered. The flaps were 2-sectional and separated by the engine nacelles. Ailerons that controlled roll were also separated in 2 parts to avoid issues as a result of aerodynamic deformation of the wing. The tail consisted of a vertical stabilizer to which was attached a rudder to control the yaw of the airplane. There was a horizontal stabilizer to which were attached 2 elevators to control the pitch of the plane. Their construction was all metal. The tail assembly, like the wings, had a swept-back design. The horizontal stabilizer had a sweep angle of 23 degrees, and the vertical stabilizer had a sweep angle of 45 degrees. The landing gear was a 3-point tricycle scheme with a front nose wheel and 2 main wheels under the wings featuring oil pneumatic shock suspension. Usually, the wheels were released and retracted by the hydraulic mechanism. The power was supplied by 2 Jumo 004 B1 jet engines, each with a thrust of 8.83 kilonewtons or 1,984 pound-force. The Jumo 004 was the first successful axial compressor turbojet engine and a predecessor of all modern turbine jet engines. Air was sucked into the open front section, then compressed by an 8-stage compressor and injected into one of 6 combustion chambers, where the air mixed with injected fuel and was ignited, producing a stream of hot gas. Some of the power produced rotated an axial compressor. The remaining gases flowed through the nozzle and created thrust. The speed of the exhaust gas could be controlled by a movable inner cone called a zwiebel or onion bowl because of its shape. The engine was 12 feet 8 inches long, or around 3.86 meters. It was 2 feet 8 inches in diameter, or about 81 centimeters, and weighed 1,585 pounds, or 719 kilograms. To fire it up, it was started by a 2-cylinder, 2-stroke, gasoline-powered Riedel starter motor. The fuel used for the Jumo 004 was J2. This was a German World War II synthetic fuel produced from brown coal. The engine was designed to run on multiple fuels, including diesel. The two engines gave the ME-262 a maximum level flight speed of 540 miles per hour or 870 kilometers per hour. In a dive, though, it could potentially go much faster. However, the pilots were recommended to avoid a speed over 900 kilometers per hour or 560 miles per hour. The Germans were the first pilots to encounter issues with flight approaching the speed of sound. During tests, a prototype plane exceeded 970 kilometers per hour, but had severe vibrations and temporary loss of control. There is a legend about an ME-262 pilot who exceeded Mach speed and thus broke the sound barrier during World War II. But the airspeed indicator reading would have been inaccurate at this speed using a pitot tube for measurement. The rate of climb was an astounding 20 meters per second or 67 feet per second. The rate of dive in operation was not that impressive compared to the late war Allied fighters. German pilots even slowed before diving upon American bomber formations, so as not to exceed their safe speed during the attack. The fuel system consisted of 2 rubber self-sealing main tanks of 238 gallons each, or 900 litres, as well as auxiliary tanks, which gave an additional 204 gallons, or 770 litres. The main tanks could feed either the right or left engine, and this was controlled by the pilot using a switch on the left side panel of the cockpit. When the remaining fuel was reduced to 250 litres, or 66 gallons, a warning light was lit on the dashboard. The pilot had the job of balancing the fuel levels in the fuel tanks during flight to ensure stability. The maximum volume of fuel could, in theory, keep the ME-262 in the air for 60 to 90 minutes and give the plane a maximum range of 1,050 kilometers or 650 miles. The main armament consisted of 4 Mk108 cannons with a 30mm or 1.2-inch caliber. Each cannon had a rate of fire of 650 rounds per minute, with a muzzle velocity of 520 meters per second, or 1,507 feet per second. The length of each gun was 3.3 feet, or 1 meter, and its barrel was 1.8 feet, or around half a meter. The electric triggers were located on the pilot's control stick. The cannon reloading mechanism was electro-pneumatic. Ammunition was stored in belts in protected boxes. A 0.72-pound shell with 0.19 pounds of explosive was capable of bringing down a heavy bomber, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress or B-24 Liberator, in just 4 hits. It needed just a single shattering hit to bring down an Allied fighter. Due to its distinctive pounding sound and high rate of fire, Allied aircrews called the Mk108 the pneumatic hammer. there were large spherical supports around the barrels, which enabled adjustments to the gun's convergence. The guns usually were set to converge at around 450 to 500 meters, or around 500 to 550 yards. In front of the guns was a gun camera that activated whenever the pilot fired any of his guns, and stopped immediately upon releasing the trigger. Under the wings, there were mounted wooden racks with rockets. Several unguided missile models were tested and implemented on Schwalbe, the most advanced of which was the R4M 4-kilogram rocket. These missiles could be fired from distances of up to 1,000 meters or 1,100 yards. Their trajectory in the middle range was roughly similar to the trajectory of the shots from the Mk108, so the same gun sight could be used for the aiming of both weapons. Accuracy of these rockets was poor, so the Germans compensated this with numbers. Usually, an Me-262A1 carried 24 of these missiles in total, a dozen under each wing. The rockets had electrical ignition and could be launched as a volley or one by one. Aside from the fuel tanks and the bulkheads around them, the cockpit was protected by a frontal 3.5-inch 90mm bulletproof glass and a 15mm 3/5 of an inch steel backplate behind the pilot's seat. On later planes, the backplate was extended to reach behind the pilot's head. The cockpit had a 3-section canopy. The cabin's layout was traditional, with only the engine indicator panel taking more space than usual. Trim regulators, engine throttles, hydraulic, pneumatic and oxygen indicators and controls were to the left of the pilot. Switchboard, radio controls and Riedel engine starters to the turbines were controlled on the right-hand side of the pilot. And the instrument panel with the 2 clusters of indicators, flight indicators to the left and engine indicators to the right, was directly in front of the pilot. A rocket launch panel was added below the main instrument panel. The gun sight used most of the time in the Me-262's short career was the standard sight of the Luftwaffe, the Revi 16B. This was a reflector gun sight, which projected a ring and crosshair reticle onto glass directly in front of the pilot. It was less effective than the later gyroscope-tuned EZ-42 model, but was effective enough for short ranges and against large targets. To enter the cabin, a pilot would climb on the left wing and lift the middle section of the canopy and climb in. The seat had no padding, and so the pilot sat on his parachute. After entering, the pilot would buckle up. The pilot would activate a number of switches in order: the battery switch, then the inverter, then the generators. He would ensure that the fuel selector valve was off and the throttles were at minimum. He would push down the starter handle to prime the Riedel starting motor. He would then pull the starter handle and hold, and at the same time he would press the tachometer button and hold it in. The engines would then rotate. When each engine reached 700 to 800 revolutions per minute, the pilot would press the ignition button on the right side of the throttle and hold. A deep throbbing noise would be heard as the unit began firing. Then the engine speed would be increased to around 1,800 to 2,000 RPM. The pilot could then release the starter handle and tachometer button and open a fuel selector valve. At this time, the rear fuel tank is supplying both engines. The pilot would slowly advance the throttle to 3,000 RPM. At 3,000 RPM, the pilot released the throttle ignition button as the engine is now self-igniting. On the ground, the pilot steered by using the main wheel brakes. By now, the jets are running at 4,000 to 6,000 RPM. With the plane in position, the pilot would hold the aircraft with the main wheel brakes and open the throttles very slowly for the engine to reach around 7,000 RPM. He would then switch the left engine to the front main fuel tank and the right engine to the rear main fuel tank. Releasing the brakes and opening the throttles fully would start the plane down the runway. All the while, he would make directional corrections with brakes only. The control stick would be in a neutral position. After the takeoff speed of around 125 miles per hour was reached, the pilot would pull gently back on the stick. This would move the elevators at the rear into a raised position, and the plane would gently become airborne. To stop the wheels rotating, the pilot would apply the brakes before retracting the landing gear. Initially, the ME-262 would climb higher than the expected target formation altitude. Once in position, the pilot would switch on the power for the guns and rockets and flip the metal safety cover forward on top of the control stick. Then, when the enemy was in sight, the pilot would quickly fly to the side and above the enemy. When ready, he would slightly bleed the speed, turning into the formation and dive. He would aim to cut across the box formation of the bombers. Looking through the Revi 16 gun sight, the pilot would see the glowing crosshair with the range marks and the ring. The pilot calculated range and deflection based upon experience. If taking on a B-17, the pilot would look as to where the wingtips of the B-17 would appear on the sight. If the wings filled 2 full marks, that would mean the distance was around 1,100 yards or 1 kilometer. When the plane was at a distance of 1,100 to 600 yards or 1 kilometer to 550 meters, the pilot would press the switch to launch a volley of rockets. And then, when the B-17's wingtips filled almost the entire circle, the distance would be around 330 yards or 300 meters. The pilot would press the buttons to fire short bursts from his 30mm guns to shoot at any available target as he passed. After diving, the ME-262 would try to climb back higher than the bombers to make another pass. But if too many escort fighters were gunning on him, the pilot may simply accelerate and outrun the pursuers until they lost sight of the German jet. When low on fuel or ammunition, the pilot would head for home. Inability to maneuver and relatively slow speed at takeoff and landing was used by Allied pilots to catch the ME-262s when they were at their most vulnerable. By diving at slow and unmaneuverable targets from above, this tactic got the nickname rat catching. It's estimated that around 1,470 ME-262s were built in total. Due to delivery and logistics issues and a lack of trained pilots, only around 300 ME-262s took part in action. Eventually, the ME-262 proved to be a formidable interceptor. But at this time, the German industry was too damaged and the US industry produced too many planes that the ME-262 could not really make a difference. The ME-262's conceptual scheme was copied in many designs, such as the Soviet Su-9 and the Japanese Nakajima Kika. Some design ideas from the ME-262 were used in several prominent planes, including the MiG-15 and the F-86 and B-47s. The turbojet engine, housed in an underwing nacelle, proved to be such a successful design that it still features today in almost all modern airliners. The Yokosuka MXY-7, also known as the Ohka, was a manned missile designed by the Japanese. It housed a single pilot for a one-way mission. Translated into English, Ohka means cherry blossom, but the Allies referred to it as the Baka bomb or idiot bomb. There were several versions of the Ohka, but this video focuses on the operational Model 11. The main fuselage was tubular in shape and was 19 feet 11 inches long, with a diameter of just under 2 feet. At its core was an aluminium airframe. Longerons went the length of the aircraft, which supported formers. Over the frame of the aircraft, aluminum sheets were fastened to create the skin of the aircraft. This gave the aircraft a very light construction, apart from the warhead, which took up most of the weight of the aircraft. A single piece of nose cowling covered the warhead. The wings were made of an aluminium structure of spars and ribs. Attached to this was balsa wood to form the skin of the aircraft. From what we've seen in photos, this looks like it was done with a self-tapping screw. The wings were 16 feet 10 inches wide and had ailerons to control the roll. The Ohka's tail featured 2 vertical stabilizers. This type of design is known as a twin tail, which, as well as giving more stability and control, acted as a counterweight to the heavy nose that carried the warhead. The long nose of the aircraft was mainly taken up by the warhead. The warhead was encased in steel so as to provide the maximum armor-piercing capability upon Allied shipping. The armor-piercing warhead weighed in at 2,646 pounds, but 1,141 pounds was explosive material. The aircraft was 4,718 pounds in total. The nose warhead contained 5 fuses, 1 in the nose of the bomb and 4 in the base. The nose fuse was armed by a spinner that could be freed to spin upon release of the Ohka. The other 4 fuses were armed by the pilot. Moving to the back, the Ohka was powered by 3 Type 4 Mark I Model 20 rocket engines. A solid rocket engine works by burning solid propellant to produce high pressure and high temperature gases, which are then expelled out of a nozzle at the back of the rocket to produce thrust. The basic components of a solid rocket engine are the casing. This is the outer shell or body of the rocket engine that holds everything together. It has to be very strong, enough to withstand the high pressures generated from inside the engine. The nozzle. This is the opening at the back of the rocket where the gases are expelled out. The nozzle is designed to accelerate the gases and expel them at high speed, generating thrust. And solid propellant. This is the fuel and oxidizer mixed together in a solid form. The fuel is what burns, and the oxidizer is a chemical that provides the oxygen needed for the fuel to combust. The propellant is packed into the casing in a cylindrical shape with a hole running down the middle, known as the core. According to US scientists that analyzed the Ohka, the chemical analysis of the propellant was 59.9% nitrocellulose, 26.9% nitroglycerin, and 6.1% mononitronaphthalene, 2.9% ethyl centralite, and 1.3% volatiles. The engine output was 588 pound-feet of thrust. In each of the 3 Ohka's engines were 6 tubes of propellant. They were arranged in 3 groups of 2, effectively making 3 long tubes of propellant. The motor was lit using a small igniter that was placed at the end of the engine furthest from the nozzle. It was activated by the pilot by means of an electrical signal. When the igniter was lit, a very fast-burning material that produced hot gases and particles was expelled into the core of each of the 3 tubes of propellant in the motor. These hot gases and particles ideally ignited the inside of the surfaces of the 6 sticks of solid propellant evenly along the length of the engine, initiating the combustion process. Let's go through the inside of the cockpit. First, there was a red switch that would be set to arm 4 of the 5 fuses on the warhead. Then, the rocket selector switch. This would allow the pilot to select which rocket motor would be activated when pressing a button on the joystick. The switch would usually have 5 settings: off, 1, 2, and 3 for the main rockets, and another setting for some models of Ohka that had underwing rockets for extra range. The intercommunication switch was for sending and receiving Morse code to the carrying Betty. There was also a compass. An altimeter showed the height to sea level and worked through an air pressure sensor. The airspeed indicator used a pitot tube located on the left wing to determine the airspeed. There was also a turn and slip indicator that used a gimbal-mounted gyro. The turn and slip indicator is a flight instrument that was used to understand the orientation and movement of the aircraft in the horizontal plane. It consisted of 2 components, a turn indicator and a slip indicator. The turn indicator shows the rate at which the aircraft is turning. It indicates whether the aircraft is in a coordinated turn without any side slipping or skidding. The slip indicator, when centered, shows the aircraft is in coordinated flight. If it moves to one side, it indicates a slip or a skid. Together, these 2 indicators help the pilot maintain coordinated flight during turns. Then there was an inclinometer that indicated the vertical angle of flight. The inclinometer used in Ohkas was a Model 2 manufactured by Tokyo Koku Keiki Seisakusho. It differs from a standard inclinometer by having a modified scale, placing the 0 mark near the top to better indicate steeper dive angles. The circuit test switch activated the aircraft electrical systems. The red light signaled the activation of the electrical circuit. The pilot's controls consisted of a joystick and a rudder. The joystick, when moved left and right, moved the ailerons on the wings, which controlled the roll of the aircraft. When pushed forward or pulled back, it moved the elevator in the tail and controlled the pitch of the aircraft. On the joystick was also a button to activate the rocket that was currently selected on the rocket selector dial. The rudder control wasn't pedals, but was more rudimentary, as a bar that pivoted upon its center. This activated the 2 rudder control surfaces on the tail and controlled the yaw of the aircraft. These simple solid rocket motors could not be shut off once they were lit. The rockets would propel the Ohka to a top speed of up to 400 miles per hour in level flight and 580 miles per hour in a dive. The rocket had a burning time of just 8 to 10 seconds, which meant very short range. Contrary to most depictions of the Ohka in games and in art, the engines were not designed to be fired simultaneously. Instead, to maximize range, the pilot had a control dial, which could be rotated, and then a button pushed to fire one rocket at a time. We'll take you through that later on. In order to get the Ohka in position, it was carried underneath a Mitsubishi G4M2E Betty bomber. The maximum range of the Ohka depended upon the height it was released. Typically, the range was about 35 times the release height. However, they could be released at 10,000 feet, and this would give a range of about 18 miles. Some 50 miles from the target, having said a formal farewell to the bomber's crew, the pilot crawled through the bomb bay and into the cockpit of the Ohka. The first thing the pilot would do is buckle up. Then, on the floor, at the 8 o'clock and 4 o'clock positions were bungee cords secured to the footbar, which were removed by the pilot. The bungee cords prevented the rudder from being activated while the Ohka was being carried by the Betty bomber. The pilot would also remove a pair of thin metal rods attached to the joystick at the 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock positions. The cables and rods were always handed up to an assistant in the bomber as a safety measure, because if left inside the cockpit, they might jam the controls or fly around and injure the pilot. There was a fifth restraining device that was a combination of a metal rod with an eye hook attached to a spring on the joystick. It stayed connected to prevent the pilot from pulling back on the joystick at the moment of release, which could cause the Ohka to lurch up and strike the Betty. The pilot would then reach over his head to pull a little wooden block until the canopy slid forward and snapped shut. He would then switch the engines to standby and activate the fuse handle, arming the warhead. He would take a padded earpiece. Once all was ready, he would announce into the mouthpiece, "Seibi Junbi Yoroshi," while pressing the button of the instrument panel to tap out the Morse code symbol for Sei, the Morse abbreviation of his message. A flashing light and a buzzer gave him visual and audio confirmation of his Morse code message. The Betty pilot pulled the lever. The hook would release from the hoist point, and the Ohka would drift away from the Betty, the point of no return. The Ohka's flight began as a shallow, unpowered glide, reaching a speed of 230 to 280 miles per hour. The spinner can now move freely. A cotter pin prevented the spinner from moving while it was attached to the aircraft. The warhead would now be fully armed. The pilot had a dial to select a rocket and then push the button on the joystick to light the rocket. When the rocket was lit, the pilot would experience instant acceleration. When one rocket was burnt out, he would select the next one, and so on. Standard operating procedure was to leave one rocket until the final part of the Ohka's approach to an enemy vessel. With the weight of the other two rockets already expended, the final rocket would be where the Ohka reached maximum speed. Having lined the target on the enemy vessel, the Ohka would impact above the waterline. Instantly, the wooden and steel structure would disintegrate, leaving the armor-piercing warhead to push through the side of the vessel before detonating from within.